Hello, RotoBallers. What did the football coach say to the candy machine? Give me my quarterback. Okay, now that I got that out of the way, here are my starts and sits at the wide receiver and quarterback positions for week number 14. First up, those wide receivers. And Courtland Sutton versus the Los Angeles Chargers. How bad is the Chargers back end? Even after playing the Patriots last week, they have still conceded the 7th most fantasy points over the last 4 weeks to the wide receiver position. And even after playing New England, they have allowed 4 touchdowns and 640 receiving yards over that period. So you have to feel that Courtland Sutton against this pass defense is set for a big day. Sutton comes into this week scoring 9 times in 13 contests for the Broncos, which should easily become 10 in his 14 contests, considering that the Chargers have allowed 13 touchdowns to wide receivers through 13 weeks. It's basic math, people. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or Josh Dobbs to figure this out. My second wide receiver that I'm firing up this week is DJ Moore versus Detroit. Back on November 19th, Moore hauled in 7 of 9 targets for 96 yards and a touchdown. The truth is, Justin Fields only has eyes for his number 1 wide receiver, who has seen at least 9 targets in 3 straight contests. Moore is 14th in receptions, 9th in receiving yards, and 4th when it comes to yards after the catch, and he faces a Lions defense that has allowed 765 yards and 7 touchdowns to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, which is about 43.13 fantasy points per game, or the 3rd most in that 4-week period. Now, my third wide receiver that I'm firing up, how about Elijah Moore versus the Jacksonville Jaguars? If you are looking for a sleeper, there may not be a better one out there than Moore, as long as Joe Flacco is under center. Last week, Moore saw 12 targets from Flacco, just like he did back when the two were together in New York. With Amari Cooper dealing with a concussion, more targets could actually be funneled towards Moore this week. And Jacksonville, they've allowed 41.5 fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks, which happens to be the 5th most. And P.S. Michael Pittman is always a must start. Don't overthink it. Get Pittman in your lineup too. As for those sits, you are sitting Adam Thielen this week versus the New Orleans Saints. Bottom line, none of these wide receivers in Carolina are getting any kind of separation to help out their rookie quarterback. And that includes Adam Thielen, who between weeks 2 through 8 was putting up more than 15 fantasy points per game there. Fantasy football is a what have you done for me lately type game, and Thielen has been disappointing, combining for just 6.7 fantasy points over his last 2 contests. Sure, the weather may have played a factor last week, but it did not stop future Hall of Famer Mike Evans, just saying. Now, it doesn't get any easier this week, facing a Saints team that has allowed just 1 touchdown and 300 yards to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks, which is the fewest fantasy points yielded. A second sit for me is Calvin Ridley versus the Cleveland Browns. The loss of Trevor Lawrence hurts every pass catcher in Duval County when we are talking about fantasy production. C.J. Beathard delivering passes against the Browns defense that has allowed just 1 receiving touchdown to wide receivers this season and has held opposing wide receivers to under 28 fantasy points per game through 13 weeks is about as strong of an indication of a fade as what the fantasy gods are going to give you at any given time. And another fade at the wide receiver position is Garrett Wilson versus the Houston Texans. It is never a good sign when the recently relegated quarterback says, "Nah, I'm good, bro," when it comes to being asked if he's planning on starting again. But even Zach Wilson, he knows things are bad in New York. Garrett Wilson has been getting open. Unfortunately, the combination of Tim Boyle and Trevor Siemian simply hasn't been getting the job done. It's been so bad that Tim Boyle was just cut. And apparently the answer is Brett Rippon. I don't think so. Good matchup, bad situation. Now, turning our attention to the quarterbacks I'm starting, it starts with Jordan Love versus the New York Giants. Since week 10, only 2 quarterbacks have produced more fantasy points than Jordan Love's 89.8. Love is averaging 22.5 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks, with 18.7 being his lowest total in that period. On the opposite side of the field, we have the New York Giants, who over the 4 previous contests are allowing, on average, 18.85 fantasy points per game, which happens to be the 9th most. One thing Love has done that no other quarterback has done is throw for 3 or more touchdowns and 0 interceptions in 4 different games this season. Another quarterback you should feel good about this week is Justin Fields versus the Detroit Lions. I am stacking Bears this week. It's like a 3-ring fantasy circus. The last time that these teams met, Fields may have only been 16 for 23 for 169 yards, but he also carried the ball 18 times for an additional 104 yards. Now, Detroit's top priority should be to contain Fields within the pocket, but that is easier said than done. In the last 4 games in which Fields has played a full contest, he has been arguably better than Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. averaging 312 total yards per game while turning the ball over just 4 times and accounting for 9 Bears touchdowns. Back on November 15th, remember, he left that contest early against the Vikings. One more quarterback to go. How about a streamer here? Gardner Minshew is always a great streaming option as the Colts face the Bengals that has been below average at best when it comes to EPA this season. And it's tough to argue with Minshew's results after watching him go for 312 yards and a pair of touchdowns last week. Minshew, he should be once again able to throw the ball all over the field here against a Bengals secondary that has allowed 1,219 yards and 5 passing touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. How about those quarterbacks that you're sitting? Matthew Stafford versus Baltimore. Surprisingly, the Ravens have been susceptible to the pass in recent weeks, allowing the 16th most fantasy points to the position over that 4-week period. But on the season, no team has been allowing fewer than the 10.22 fantasy points per game the Ravens defense has to the quarterback position. Baltimore ranks 4th in passing yards allowed while allowing the fewest passing touchdowns, 8. They also have 47 sacks, which is 5 more than the Colts, who are second in the league when it comes to that, and they picked off opposing signal callers on 10 separate occasions. Making things even more difficult for Matthew Stafford is that Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp are both battling injuries heading into this contest. A big name quarterback that you're sitting this week is Justin Herbert versus the Denver Broncos. Normally benching a top tier quarterback is crazy talk unless it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, people, and that is the case with Justin Herbert. Herbert in back-to-back games has been held under 15 fantasy points and has just 1 touchdown to show for it between those 2 performances. Need some more analytics? How about over the last 8 contests, Herbert has failed to produce more than 20 fantasy points on 5 occasions while being held under 15 fantasy points in 4 of those games. Denver's defense has been hit or miss, as CJ Stroud did manage to throw for 274 yards and a touchdown, but the Broncos in the last 5 games, they have forced 15 turnovers, including 5 interceptions, and held quarterbacks under 15 fantasy points over the last 4 weeks. So for that, I am out. Now, my other quarterback that I'm out on this week is Jared Goff versus the Chicago Bears. This time, the Lions, they head into Chicago. This is important. As we know, historically, Goff has played better at home than he has on the road. Then again, in Detroit, against this Bears team, he threw for just 236 yards and a pair of touchdowns to go along with a trio of interceptions. Including that divisional showdown with the Lions, Chicago has allowed just 3 passing touchdowns while picking off the opposition on 7 occasions over the last 4 weeks, and has been allowing just 9.15 fantasy points to quarterbacks, which is the second fewest over that period of time. Now our time is up, so I say once again, this video is being recorded on Monday, so plenty can happen between now and Sunday's kickoff. So make sure to check out RotoBaller.com and the RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Thanks for tuning in, and be sure to like and subscribe to our RotoBaller YouTube channel for plenty more great fantasy football analysis.